Hi everyone and welcome back. In this part of lecture, we're going to have a chance to explore how culture and religion have influenced death rituals over time. This is a vast and fascinating topic, and we certainly won't be able to touch upon everything in lecture. However, we'll give it a go and we'll have some fun exploring some of these various traditions and practices that we may not be as familiar with. The ways in which people respond to death varies by culture and by historical period. Regardless of these differences, all cultures seek to assign meaning to death. Some see death as part of everyday life, whereas others try to avoid it at all costs. There are many determinants of the grief response, as we learned earlier in the semester. At the same time, we need to recognize that there are also many determinants of death rituals. On the slide here, we see some of the main areas that influence not only what one believes about life and death, but how that then impacts what types of traditions and rituals they carry out as someone is dying, when they actually die, and then following death. So when we look at culture, we have to remember that this goes far beyond race. Culture is all those elements that help make up our life as we know it. Things like one's ethnicity, the geography or where we live, such as urban versus rural, mountain region versus desert or coastal region, or even lush forests. Culture also involves things like social roles and expectations, your family structure, whether or not you live in a more individualistic or collectivist society, and then various community norms, responsibilities, and expectations. These things all influence aspects of our life, so it makes sense that these same things may influence how we see and cope with death. Religion and spirituality are important parts of life for many people. One's religious or spiritual beliefs dictate or drive their spiritual practices, rituals, and traditions. They can also provide structure and guidance as far as what's expected during one's life, and then when one dies as well. All of these factors, culture, historical time period, and religion and spirituality, play a direct role in how one perceives death, how they assign meaning to death, as well as their beliefs surrounding what happens after death. Ultimately, these all help determine the specific death rituals that occur. We've spent quite a bit of time exploring the more westernized approach to death and dying in this class all semester. Everything from theories of grief to specific things we should or should not do to promote a peaceful death in American culture. Most recently, we looked at advanced directives and aspects of funeral planning. But it's important for us to remember that not everyone does or believes the same things. Death is viewed differently. Rituals vary greatly, and customs are unique and adapted to each specific culture, subculture, and even down to one's own family unit. This week's lectures and activities will give us an opportunity to explore some of these different cultural and religious views in more depth. So what are some examples of how culture and religion have influenced death rituals across time? Let's start with earliest man and then move forward into modern times. The history of death and dying rituals is older than civilization itself. Archaeological evidence of ritual burial ceremonies date back as far as the Neanderthal, some 150,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found decorated shells, primitive tools, animal antlers, and flower fragments next to Neanderthal corpses, which indicate some type of ritual after or during that time of death. We can see here in this photograph that's taken at an archaeological site. See the jewelry around their necks, the antlers placed above their heads, and the shells next to their gravesite? I think it's pretty amazing that we're able to learn and study from these findings, as they really shed light into the lives and deaths of even the earliest human beings. Moving forward in history, we see an amazing example of Stone Age architecture and customs. Newgrange was built over 5,000 years ago, making it even older than the Great Pyramids and older than Stonehenge. It was built by farmers in the Boyne River Valley of County Meath in Ireland. This ancient temple and burial chamber had astrological, spiritual, religious, and ceremonial importance. It was built using ancient construction techniques, allowing the passage and inner burial chamber to become illuminated only once a year when the sun is aligned on the winter solstice. I've had the opportunity to visit, and it's incredible. The main structure itself is huge, and you walk all the way through this passageway to a small area where people's remains were entombed. To give you an idea of how big it is, I included a picture in the top right corner. This is a large rock, almost as tall as I am, that has been etched with early Celtic designs by the farmers who built Newgrange. It stands at the front entrance to the ancient structure. Now, if you look at the aerial photo on the left, you can see the main entrance, that small opening, and then get a better idea of how large this monument really is. We can learn a lot about life and death through the art, architecture, and artifacts of ancient Egypt as well. There are more than 100 pyramids in Egypt, the largest and most famous of which are the Great Pyramids of Giza. These were built over 4,500 years ago, and many pyramids served as giant tombs or burial chambers for powerful pharaohs and other important people in Egypt at the time. The Valley of the Kings, pictured on the left here, is a large, sprawling, above and underground burial ground of ancient Egyptian pharaohs and is one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. King Tut, whose golden mask we see at the top of the slide, was entombed here in the Valley of the Kings. These pyramids and burial sites were archaeological wonders, with some blocks of stone weighing more than 80 tons apiece. That's over 160,000 pounds each. If you look at the bottom right image, we can see a kind of blueprint, if you will, of what the insides of one of these pyramids looks like. We see various burial chambers, a mortuary chamber where they would have prepared the bodies, and other important architectural features. It's pretty amazing to know that these were built by men without our modern construction capabilities. During the Middle Ages and extending into the Age of Enlightenment, it became common practice to bury people's remains far underground in complex burial grounds called catacombs. I showed you a picture of some catacombs in our lecture on funerals, but I wanted you to see that catacombs served different purposes and also varied quite a bit in terms of how they were built and how people's bodies were arranged. Two problems began to emerge during this time period, which brought about the need for catacombs. For one, disease began to spread when people were buried above ground. There were no such things as vaults, and many people didn't even use coffins yet, so bodies were simply buried below the dirt, which then allowed any disease or infection to spread through the soil and contaminate the ground, water sources, and so forth. The other problem was that there was limited space in communities. They began to run out of room to bury everyone, so they needed to solve this problem, and catacombs were a great solution. There are catacombs all over different parts of Europe in particular. Above, I've provided some pictures from different catacombs. Catacombs were religious cemeteries that belonged to early Christians. On the bottom left, where we see skulls arranged neatly on top of other bones, is from a catacomb in Paris. In the middle, and in the taller picture on the right, we see a catacomb built by Capuchin monks, which was much more elaborate. They mummified the bodies of those who died, particularly the powerful or well-off in their community, who would then pick out what outfits or jewelry they wanted to be wearing when they died. This particular catacomb has over 8,000 mummified corpses on display in a respectful way. Although I don't know about you, I think I might still be a little caught off guard or a little creeped out if I walked in and saw these mummies lining all of the walls and passageways. Finally, on the top right picture is an image from inside the catacombs of Callistus, where we see art in the form of paintings and drawings alongside the burial openings. The Renaissance literally means rebirth and was a period in European civilization that immediately followed the Middle Ages. The Renaissance brought a revival of classical learning and wisdom, and we saw great advancements in arts, literature, astronomy, discovery, and exploration. When we look at funerary art, or art related to funeral and burials, we see absolutely breathtaking pieces created during this time period. It became important to develop tombs into elaborate pieces of art, comprised of marble, sculptures, paintings, and gold. Granted, not everyone got this type of resting place, but many people of great importance were forever revered when entombed in this manner. Many of these tombs are in churches, and I've provided some examples here on the slide. If we start on the left, we see the tombs of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York in Westminster Abbey in London, England. This is the outside of their tomb, like an above-ground casket in a mausoleum, and it's made out of gold. Theirs are just two of hundreds of tombs for important people buried within Westminster Abbey and its surrounding buildings. Some were buried in the churches themselves, and others in crypts below the abbey. The other two pictures are places that I've been, and they're absolutely stunning. In the middle, we see the Medici Chapel in the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Florence, Italy. Michelangelo was commissioned by the powerful Medici family to design and build this grand and striking mausoleum. This was their Chapel of the Princes. I know it's kind of hard to see, but if you look closely, you see the tombs are set into the walls themselves, with elaborate statues of the prince inside who's standing above it. Other famous people entombed in a different part of this church include the artist Donatello and many members of the aristocratic Medici family, many of whom were also popes in the Catholic Church. Ironically, even though Michelangelo created this masterpiece, he was buried elsewhere. We see his tomb on the far right, in the Basilica of Santa Croce, which is also in Florence, Italy. Other illustrious Italians are also entombed here, such as Galileo and Machiavelli. This basilica, Santa Croce, where Michelangelo is buried, is the largest Franciscan church in the world, making it a fitting final resting place for many of the era's elite. In many cases, ancient practices continue into modern society. Some of what we do stems from practices hundreds or thousands of years ago, and in different parts of the world that have been inhabited for thousands of years longer than the United States, we see many important rituals related to life and death that continue much in the way they were carried out several generations ago. Here's one fascinating example. In Tanah Toraja, weddings and births aren't the social gatherings that knit society together. In this part of Indonesia, big, raucous funerals form the center of social life. Anthropologist Kelly Swayze takes a look at this culture in which the bodies of dead relatives are cared for even for years after they have passed. While it sounds strange to Western sensibilities, she says, this could actually be a truer reflection of the fact that relationships with loved ones don't simply end when breathing does. Let's watch Kelly's TED Talk and hear what she has to say, not just about this specific culture's traditions, but her larger message or meaning that it could have for all of us.
I think it's safe to say that all humans will be intimate with death at least once in their lives. But what if that intimacy began long before you faced your own transition from life into death? What would life be like if the dead literally lived alongside you? In my husband's homeland, in the highlands of Sulawesi Island in eastern Indonesia, there is a community of people that experience death not as a singular event, but as a gradual social process. In Tanah Toraja, The most important social moments in people's lives, the focal points of social and cultural interaction, are not weddings or births or even family dinners, but funerals. So these funerals are characterized by elaborate rituals that tie people in a system of reciprocal debt based on the amount of animals, pigs, chickens, and most importantly, water buffalo, that are sacrificed and distributed in the name of the deceased. So this cultural complex surrounding death, the ritual enactment of the end of life, has made death the most visible and remarkable aspect of Toraja's landscape. Lasting anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, funeral ceremonies are a raucous affair where commemorating someone who's died is not so much a private sadness, but more of a publicly shared transition. And it's a transition that's just as much about the identity of the living as it is about remembrance of the dead. So every year, thousands of visitors come to Tanah Toraja to see, as it were, this culture of death. And for many people, these grandiose ceremonies and the length of the ceremonies are somehow incommensurable with the way that we face our own mortality in the West. So even as we share death as a universal experience, it's not experienced the same way the world over. And as an anthropologist, I see these differences in experience being rooted in the cultural and social worlds through which we define the phenomena around us. So where we see an unquestionable reality, death as an irrefutable biological condition, Torajans see the expired corporeal form as part of a larger social genesis. So again, the physical cessation of life is not the same as death. In fact, a member of society is only truly dead when the extended family can agree upon and marshal the resources necessary to hold a funeral ceremony that is considered appropriate in terms of resources for the status of the deceased. And this ceremony has to take place in front of the eyes of the whole community with everyone's participation. So after a person's physical death, their body is placed in a special room in the traditional residence, which is called a tongkonan. And the tongkonan is symbolic not only of the family's identity, but also of the human life cycle from birth to death. So essentially the shape of the building that you're born into is the shape of the structure which carries you to your ancestral resting place. Until the funeral ceremony, which can be held years after a person's physical death, the deceased is referred to as to makala, a sick person, or to mama, a person who is asleep. And they continue to be a member of the household. They are symbolically fed and cared for, and the family at this time will begin a number of ritual injunctions which communicates to the wider community around them that one of their members is undergoing the transition from this life into the afterlife known as puya. So I know what some of you must be thinking right now. Is she really saying that these people live with the bodies of their dead relatives? And that's exactly what I'm saying. But instead of giving in to this sort of visceral reaction we have to this idea of proximity to bodies, proximity to death, or how this notion just does not fit into our very biological or medical sort of definition of death, I like to think about what the Torajan way of viewing death encompasses of the human experience, but the medical definition leaves out. I think that Torajans socially recognize and culturally express what many of us feel to be true, despite the widespread acceptance of the biomedical definition of death. and that is that our relationships with other humans, their impact on our social reality doesn't cease with the termination of the physical processes of the body. That there's a period of transition as the relationship between the living and the dead is transformed, but not ended. So Tarajans express this idea of this enduring relationship by lavishing love and attention on the most visible symbol of that relationship, the human body. So my husband has fond memories of talking to and playing with and generally being around his deceased grandfather. And for him, there is nothing unnatural about this. This is a natural part of the process as the family comes to terms with a transition in their relationship to the deceased. And this is the transition from relating to the deceased as a person who's living to relating to the deceased as a person who's an ancestor. And here you can see these wooden effigies of the ancestors. So these are people who have already been buried, already had a funeral ceremony. These are called tau tau. So the funeral ceremony itself embodies this relational perspective on death. It ritualizes the impact of death on families and communities. And it's also a moment of self-awareness. It's a moment when people think about who they are, their place in society, and their role in the life cycle in accordance with Tarajan cosmology. There's a saying in Taraja that all people will become grandparents. And what this means is that after death, we all become part of the ancestral line that anchors us between the past and the present and will define who our loved ones are into the future. So essentially, we all become grandparents to the generations of human children that come after us. And this metaphor of membership in the greater human family is the way that children also describe the money that they invest in these sacrificial buffaloes that are thought to carry people's soul from here to the afterlife. And children will explain that they will invest the money in this because they want to repay their parents the debt for all of the years their parents spent investing and caring for them. But the sacrifice of buffalo and the ritual display of wealth also exhibits the status of the deceased, and by extension, the deceased's family. So at funerals, relationships are reconfirmed but also transformed in a ritual drama that highlights the most salient feature about death in this place: its impact on life and the relationships of the living. So all of this focus on death doesn't mean that Tarajans don't aspire to the ideal of a long life. They engage in many practices thought to confer good health and survival to an advanced age. But they don't put much stock in efforts to prolong life in the face of debilitating illness or in old age. It's said in Taraja that everybody has sort of a predetermined amount of life. It's called the sunga. And like a thread, it should be allowed to unspool to its natural end. So by having death as a part of the cultural and social fabric of life, people's everyday decisions about their health and health care are affected. The patriarch of my husband's maternal clan, Nenek Kacha, is now approaching the age of 100 as far as we can tell. And there are increasing signs that he is about to depart on his own journey for Puya, and his death will be greatly mourned. But I know that my husband's family looks forward to the moment when they can ritually display what his remarkable presence has meant to their lives, when they can ritually recount his life's narrative, weaving his story into the history of their community. His story is their story. His funeral songs will sing them a song about themselves. And it's a story that has no discernible beginning, no foreseeable end, It's a story that goes on long after his body no longer does. People ask me if I'm frightened or repulsed by participating in a culture where the physical manifestations of death greet us at every turn. But I see something profoundly transformative in experiencing death as a social process and not just a biological one. In reality, the relationship between the living and the dead has its own drama in the U.S. healthcare system, where decisions about how long to stretch the thread of life are made based on our emotional and social ties with the people around us, not just on medicine's ability to prolong life. We, like the Trojans, base our decisions about life on the meanings and the definitions that we ascribe to death. So I'm not suggesting that anyone in this audience should run out and adopt the traditions of the Trojans. Might be a little bit difficult to put into play in the United States. But I want to ask what we can gain from seeing physical death not only as a biological process, but as part of the greater human story. What would it be like to look on the expired human form with love? Because it's so intimately a part of who we all are. If we could expand our definition of death to encompass life, we could experience death as part of life, and perhaps face death with something other than fear. Perhaps one of the answers to the challenges that's facing the U.S. healthcare system, and particularly in the end-of-life care, is as simple as a shift in perspective. And the shift in perspective in this case would be to look at the social life of every death. It might help us recognize that the way we limit our conversation about death to something that's medical or biological is reflective of a larger culture that we all share of avoiding death, being afraid of talking about it. If we could entertain and value other kinds of knowledge about life, including other definitions of death, it has the potential to change the discussions that we have about the end of life. It could change the way that we die. But more importantly, it could transform the way that we live. Kore sabanga.
So what do you think? How many of you were caught off guard and seemed to be stuck just thinking about how different this sounds? How many of you were able to then look beyond that at the deeper meaning, at the larger takeaway message that Kelly was suggesting? As we end this first part of lecture, I'd like you to really think about this. At the end, she drew a comparison to our own current ways of making decisions at the end of life. How might we in America have our own culture of death that may seem foreign or odd to others? She's not suggesting that one way is better or worse than another, but simply pointing out that in each culture, there are social and cultural constructs that influence how we perceive and experience death. So what do you take away from this part of lecture?